Across the street now at 102 South Main Street today is the Sozo Art Studio. This was built around 1870. It housed the Kendallville Standard printing office. The Kendallville Standard was a weekly newspaper whose owner, C.O. Myers, ran it until 1882. It was later sold to Joseph Conlog, who was born in Kendallville in 1843. Conlog was a bright boy, and at the age of 16, he was sufficiently advanced in his studies that he obtained a teacher's license. He taught for 16 winters in different one-room schoolhouses in Noble County, while devoting the other seasons to farming. In the fall of 1864, he joined the Union Army and was commissioned as first lieutenant during the Civil War. Later, he became a leader of the local Republican Party. In 1882, he purchased half of the interest in the Kendallville Standard. He started the first daily newspaper in Kendallville on February 22, 1890, the Kendallville Daily Sun. He was elected to the state senate in 1900. At 104 South Main Street today is the Sinclair Bookstore. That was earlier was the Vedder Bakery 100 years ago. At 106 South Main Street is Weibel's Paint and Wallpaper. It was the Bates store from 1882 to 1916, and later part of the G.C. Murphy Company, which opened in 1951. 108 South Main Street, again, is part of the Weibel's Paint and Wallpaper building. This building was built in 1890. For many years, this was a theater. First the Hub Theater, and then the Star Theater in 1916, and later the Colonial Theater. By 1943, it was the Morris 5 and 10 cent store, and beginning in 1951, it was the G.C. Murphy Company. At 114 South Main Street is the Furniture on Main and the Turnaround Bargain Shop. This originally was a hardware and farm implement store, and later it was the A.J. Strauss dried goods store, and later part of J.C. Penney's, which opened at that location in 1928 and closed June 20th, 1992 after 64 years on Main Street. At 116 South Main Street, where the Compliance Advantage is today, this was built around 1890. It was a hardware store for many years. It was the Kroger Grocery and Bakery Company from 1929 to 1962. And from 1962 to 1974, it was the Siegley Hardware. Later the Gamble Store. Later the Pancott Hardware, and also known as the Robinson Hardware. At 118 South Main Street is part of the Compliance Advantage store. This was a meat market for many years, including the A&P store in the 1930s. The most famous robbery in the city's history took place in this store on December 2nd, 1937. Robert Shaw, 27, an itinerant farmhand from LaGrange County, robbed the grocery store of $69 in cash and shot a store clerk who came after him in the Main Street sidewalk. A manhunt ensued, ending in the death of a LaGrange County deputy and the wounding of Noble County Sheriff Irvin Kazir, the grandfather of John Kazir. The bandit was shot and captured 2 days later near the town of Ontario in LaGrange County. At 120 South Main Street is the Pizza Forum today. It was built in the 1860s. It housed the Kaiser grocery store from the 1860s until 1956. It later housed Fisher's Drug Store, started by Henry Fisher in 1913, who was the grandfather of retired Kendallville pharmacist Craig Fisher. Other later occupants were the Mode and the Nobleman. At 122 South Main Street is the Chamber of Commerce building. This building was built around 1895. The Kaiser grocery store was located here for nearly 100 years, from the 1860s until 1956. At 124 South Main Street is the Picture This in Print building. It was built around 1895. It was the Wolf Clothier men's store, later a drugstore for many, many years. This was also well known as the Central Drugstore, which had a soda fountain. At 126 South Main Street, which today is vacant, it's identified at the top of the building as the Bowen Block. It was built in September 1882. This was a dry goods store in its early days, from 1916 to 1929. It was the Dawson's 5 and 10 department store, and then later in the 50s and 60s, it was the Lord's ladies' apparel store. At 130 South Main Street is the family shears shop. For many years in the late 1890s and the early 20th century, it was the Campbell and Company dry goods store. Later it housed Gamble Hardware and later Weibel's Paint and Wallpaper. At 132 South Main Street is the Black and Raymer Insurance Building. This 3-story brick building was built by William Mitchell in 1863. The top story was removed in the 1950s after a storm. The Mitchell Bank was originally located here along with the Lohman Drugstore. The 3rd floor was known as the Mitchell Hall, and dances and social gatherings were held there. James Whitcomb Riley, famous poet, once spoke and recited poetry to an audience at Mitchell Hall. George Studebaker of the Studebaker Company of South Bend addressed the Kendallville Commercial Club, a forerunner of the Chamber of Commerce, at Mitchell Hall. Campbell and Fetter Bank was located in this building 100 years ago. At 134 South Main Street is the Beau Brummage Salon. This is where the Princess Theater once was located, also the Selleck's department store. At 136 South Main Street is where the Kendallville Computer Store is today. This building was built in 1870. It originally was the First National Bank, owned by William Mitchell. His son John Mitchell succeeded his father as bank president. The bank later became Campbell and Fetter Bank in 1894 when Archie Campbell and Jacob Fetter took over the bank from Campbell's father-in-law, John Mitchell. Kendallville's best-known popcorn stand was at the northwest corner of Main and William Streets. It stood there for many years, operated by Mrs. Cogan. And now we return to the east side of the 100 block. At 121 South Main Street is where the bargain shop is today. This was Cohen's men's clothing store 100 years ago. At 123 South Main Street is Barker's Jewelry. The present building was built around 1910. It was a drugstore, later a barber shop. In 1929, the Western Union Telegraph Company was located there. And it's been a jewelry store since 1952. At 125-127 South Main Street, the building is occupied by R&T Monuments and by Christensen's Jewelry. This building was erected in 1875 and originally was a jewelry store. Christensen's business started in 1950. At 131 South Main Street is Summers Stories. It was the D.F. Allwine dry goods store back in 1906. The Allwine family had their residence on the 2nd floor. At 137 South Main Street is the Infinite Designs building. This was built in 1882. It originally was a restaurant and later a barber shop where there were 5 barbers. At 201 South Main Street is Joanna's Delicious store. This was one of the oldest buildings downtown, erected in 1863 by John Gappinger. It was the Gappinger Harness Shop from 1863 to 1872. On July 2, 1889, Paul Klinkenberg, Gappinger's son-in-law, opened Klinkenberg's drugstore in the same location. He operated the store for 53 years. When he turned it over the operation to his son, Bob Klinkenberg operated it for the next 60 years until a couple of years before his death in 2003. At 203 South Main Street is the Affordable Photos Shop. From 1906 to 1924, this was the Lang & Sons shoe store and later a hardware. It also housed the Moto Day Women's Shop and later Fashion Crossroads. At 205-209 South Main Street is the Home Sweet Home and Once Upon a Time stores. This was built in 1889. In 1916, it housed the Trust and Savings Bank of Kendallville and later the Swartzlander Jewelry Store. The store still has a walk-in bank vault. At 213 South Main Street is Paul's Pub. This was built in 1890. It was a grocery store for many years, including 100 years ago. At 215 South Main Street is Jenny's Tacos. This is called the Dibbley Building. It was built by German-born John Dibbley in 1878 as a hardware store. Dibbley came to Kendallville to work on the railroad being constructed in Noble County. The building later was a saloon, and from 1933 to 1975, it was operated by Kenny Bleck as the Palace of Sweets, a well-known soda shop. At 217 South Main Street is Crop Insurance. This is part of the same building as that of Jenny's Tacos. It was built by John Dibbley in 1878. It was a millinery shop 100 years ago. At 219-225 South Main Street is the Floor Store and the Stand in the Strand Theater. The building was built in 1890 as the Spencer Opera House, opening on September 30th, 1890 at the cost of $26,000. Later it was sold to Al Boyer, who renamed it the Boyer Opera House. It offered vaudeville shows. In 1919 it became the Strand Theater. At 227 South Main Street is the Antiques and More. This was built as the Berhalter Cabinet and Coffin Shop in 1860, and it was operated as Berhalter Furniture Store until the 1980s. And then looking again west to the 200 block of South Main Street, at 202 South Main Street is the Douglas Adts Law Office. This was built in 1865. It was known as the Keller Building, built by Jewish immigrant Jacob Keller, who operated J. Keller and Company from 1883 to 1928. He also opened the Noble County Bank in 1891. At 206 South Main Street is the Little Shop of Music. This was built around 1880. The Gotch and Beckman Jewelry Store was located there in 1859, prior to the erection of the building. It was a jewelry store in 1911 and through the 1930s. At 212 South Main Street is the Noble County Bank Building, built in 1914. This is considered by experts to be the most interesting architectural structure in downtown Kendallville. It is a neoclassical building with Art Nouveau details. The bank closed during the Great Depression, and the Campbell and Fetter Bank took over the property in the late 1930s. At 226 South Main Street is the Northeastern Center. This was built about 1900. Among the businesses at the location over the years were a hat shop, the U.S. Post Office, the Sears and Roebuck building from 1944 to 1949, and then it was a meat shop 100 years ago. At 234-232 South Main Street is the City Hall Annex. The Air Dome, an open-air theater, was located at 234 South Main in 1910. The Schock Building was at 232 South Main Street, which was erected in 1913. Schock's New Palace Garage was the first auto dealership in Kendallville. Then we have Kendallville City Hall. The first City Hall was dedicated on July 4th, 1907. It was destroyed by fire in 1913, along with the city's sewer records and maps of the city. Two firefighters on duty at City Hall fire station were playing checkers or cards when the fire broke out. According to the rumor at the time, the two firemen were not aware of the fire until the legs of the table started burning. They managed to escape with a team of horses pulling the fire wagon, and then they returned to fight the fire. The building was a total loss, but it was said to be a blessing in disguise. The original building was poorly constructed and had been sinking. It was rebuilt and opened in 1914.